Our final keynote today is David Rivkin, CTO at GovernanceLabs.ai and Senior Director at UnitedHealthGroup, who will present a deep dive into one of the highest risk use cases for LLMs, AI Scribes. He'll walk through error taxonomies, real-world pitfalls, and testing frameworks designed to ensure accuracy and patient safety when LLMs summarize clinical encounters.
Well, welcome to this presentation that I am very pleased and privileged to be able to present to you today. We're going to be talking about some of the evaluation of AI scribes. I'm going to explain that in a few seconds. We're basically focusing on the frameworks for safe and reliable summarization. So what is that really all about? So before I really dive into this particular slide, I really want to point out something about summarization from LLMs, right? We're looking at documents, and really, the testing and the behavior, the actual ask of summarization are very much the same. So a lot of what we're going to talk about will be applicable to both the summarization task as well as the testing task. But I'll point out some key differences along the way. But let's focus on it from a testing perspective, because most of the times you're going to be working with a vendor who will provide you with summarization capabilities, and you'll want to validate them. At least that's what I do for a living. So when we're talking about summarization, I'm bringing this up because it is widely used across so many different use cases. And fundamentally, they focus on a couple of different kinds of documents, right? The static documents like your SOPs, your policies. In the case of UnitedHealthcare or another insurance provider, obviously insurance plans or benefits documents would come into that. But then you also have dynamic documents. These could be things like account histories or clinical history. And honestly, it's not as easy to summarize accurately as it might look at first case. So we're going to dive into that a little bit more. I first want to point out a couple of things that have really come up in recent months because obviously LLMs have only been around a few years. But some of the big things that people forget to understand about summarization tasks and LLMs in general, especially when they're working with a large context, is this context poisoning. The hallucinations contaminate the future reasoning, so you're doing multiple steps. That hallucination feeds back into it and makes the further information less accurate. You can have context distractions, just fundamentally too much information that's really not relevant, to be honest. So that's also context confusion, that irrelevancy of information. Information is basically taking away from the conversation. That might be something like, hey, you're sitting down with your doctor and you're talking about what you had for lunch today. Well, does that actually impact your clinical conversation with them? Probably not. You can also have a context clash, which creates these inconsistencies when conflicts become there in the actual content of the window. Something just doesn't make sense when it's pushed into a smaller form. So let's just go back to what I started with, which was the Ambient AI Scribes. This particular use case is a clinical support tool. Basically, you sit down with your GP, you have a conversation with them. The AI or your computer there records that conversation, it transcribes it, and then it extracts information from that transcription that's clinically relevant and sends that to the EHR, typically to an application that the GP or specialist will be able to look at, and they'll be able to take notes and modify it before it actually goes into the EHR. But this could be a GP, a specialist, you could be your hospital intake or discharge notes, home visits from a visiting nurse, could be going to the physiotherapist, the occupational therapist, speech therapist. Any clinical information can now be used with an Ambient AI Scribe. They're becoming very popular. And why? Well, there's some fundamental motivations, which is 50% of the time, the HR documentation process for any clinician is taking up that much of the entire consultation, of their entire day, fundamentally. So obviously, the scribes are promising some efficiency improvements here, but I must quote here directly, a single erroneous summary, factual error, or confused timeline can change the quality of care. So why does testing matter? I mean, why don't we just trust these tools? Well, there's patient safety obviously involved. There's legal and billing compliance. And eventually we'll see clinical decision-making going on. So I'm going to take a slightly detour from the Ambient AI to show you another example of where summarization is really important. So if a chatbot quotes a price for a policy, right? So it's pulled it out of even a static document, something that should be pretty easy and consistent. But if it misquotes that price quote, the insurer is legally obligated to meet that price. So this really is a big deal across not just clinical applications, but business applications as well. So some of the challenges, let's start with some of the input. The input ambiguity, it could be there's a conversation going back and forth. There may be some things that aren't very clear, like, oh, my arm hurts. Well, you have two arms, I assume, but maybe it didn't say which arm. There's certainly the domain complexity. I mean, medical jargon. If you have a patient who really knows what's going on with their health and has been through a lot, has really learned, they're going to be up on that jargon too, and obviously anything the physician says. But there's also abbreviations. Kind of in the middle is the privacy issues. There's data limitations and how you can access this, what we can really look for in terms of information and how it's processed and where does that information go and how long is it held for, things like that. And then the output side really are the error types. We have omissions, like simply it's just missing, right? Just didn't include it. It's a fabrication. We'd like to call them hallucinations. There's certainly distortions like wrong dosage or a wrong relationship. Is it the same knee and the same ankle, on the right side, or are they completely different sides? Well, it might be wrong, might have confused those two. Certainly dosages are a really big one because they have a numerical value and they have a unit of measure typically, right? So it could be milligrams or micrograms. Nah, it's 1,000 times different. If the numbers is recorded is the same, but the unit of measure is recorded incorrectly, you got a problem. You could kill somebody doing that. Certainly the opposite is true as well, right? The output can also be ambiguous. It may not be as clear as a physician would have put in. And one of the really interesting ones are merged events. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more later on. So again, I mentioned the units of measures, milligrams, micrograms. In this case, 1 gram is 1,000 milligrams. So that would be accurate, but a lot of times it's just simply not. But then there comes to be a really interesting one, which is in the clinical realm. Sometimes there's inappropriate content that might be carried over and potentially pushed into the EHR. These are things like really private conversations that maybe a patient is talking about with their GP, and things that they normally would not, the GP that is, they would not put into the EHR. They might refer you to a specialist service, maybe it's mental health services or something else, but they would not actually record that very private information. So these things all need to be taken into consideration when you're testing, and they have their unique challenges. But let's take a look at what has been going on in terms of people testing LLMs. All right. Well, one of the big ones using ROUGE scores, BLEU. These existed before LLMs even existed. Unfortunately, they're not really designed for LLMs, and they certainly focus on lexical overlap, not even semantic overlap. They're simply not factual accuracy tests. We've studied those extensively, and unfortunately, there tends to be an inverse correlation between things like RAGUS score and what the subject matter experts, the clinicians, would score as is this accurate? It's literally an inverse proportion here. So it's really a problem. Now, people have talked a lot about LLMs as a judge. Well, even the judge can potentially hallucinate facts. In fact, it can hallucinate it more when it's given the information from a summary that is part of the context. So it actually hallucinates more than would typically happen just running the LLM itself. Second problem with LLMs as a judge is, well, you can't use the same LLM to judge, the same LLM and its output, because that would just be repeating exactly the same problem. And it would result in a very high, yes, it's correct, it's perfectly accurate kind of score. But that's not actually the case. So the fundamental problem here with a lot of these existing AI-centered or other mathematical and methods are the lack of really clinical semantics. They don't understand the concepts. One of the big ones I deal with a lot is the lack of temporal awareness, that time connection between events. Did you sprain your ankle a week ago? Did you injure your knee a month ago? Did you injure your hip a year ago? Well, if you said them in that order, very often the LLM will get confused and not know which of those injuries happened at that particular time. And even if you give a specific date, a lot of times the LLMs will mix them up, especially when there's similarities, particularly in the month, in fact. If you had, say, one event that happened on January 1st, 2024, another one that happened on January 5th, 2024, another one that happened on January 27th, 2025, it might actually confuse them. Or even think that there are only two events that actually happened. Maybe those first two Januaries, one's in 2024, are actually the same date. It may be an important difference. Can't really tell you that. That would depend upon the specific case. But it certainly is very interesting to be aware of these kinds of challenges, both in terms of the development as well as the testing. So a lot of times these similar statements, these dates in particular, or other similar statements, I broke my ankle, my right ankle. Oh, then I broke my left ankle. They get them confused and then mixes it together. So rather than talking about what doesn't work, let's talk a little bit about what's, well, at least working better. Llama-Extract and Lang-Extract, one obviously from Meta, one from Google, are systems that, yes, they do use LLMs, but they work to create a structured output. Basically a class, if you will, in Python or another language, and they provide this structured event data from a clinical perspective. Now, you have to design that, and you have to be creative and think about the different ways to do that. But these frameworks are really the state of the art, at least in terms of the technology for summarization. So if I can actually contrast that with, again, something from the what doesn't work, well, just saying summarize this transcript, that's really the worst way to do things. That is not actually something the LLM understands because it doesn't understand the concept of summarization. In fact, when you say summarize, it considers that, the LLM that is, considers it to be a truncation. That's what it wants to do, is take your transcript and just chop out pieces. Well, that doesn't work very well in a clinical setting. Things are happening. It's a conversation between different people. So please consider using more advanced technology, certainly, but also technology that allows you to take this highly unstructured text, turn it into structured events, and then if you need to turn that back into sort of prose, you can use some pretty deterministic code to then write out a list of events, perhaps as an outline or bullet points, something like that, or some kind of list. That works a lot better. So when we are using a testing system, testing framework, well, Llama-Extract and Lang-Extract work quite well. Now, they're evolving systems. They're relatively new, so can't really say which one's better at this point. They both work quite well, and they're both constantly improving, and they use, like I said, LLMs behind the scenes as well. So those technologies are certainly things to look at and watch. Now, one of the things people ask me a lot of times is, well, isn't this basically just an arms race between the summarization code and the testing code? And fundamentally, you're just trying to make sure that the testing code is better by the very slightest amount, but better than the actual summarization code. No, in reality, that is kind of what is happening here. So it's a little bit of a challenge to not want to say, hey, well, if the testing system works extremely well, why shouldn't we just use that for the summarization? I'll leave that to the business people. I'm a technical person. I want to know the technical answer and make sure that we are constantly getting the best possible results from this. But in this case, these two are really outstanding ways to text your summarization. And again, I will point out, coming up with a list as the output is a much better way than saying, hey, I want some prose fancy language. Honestly, the clinicians prefer a simple, short, clean thing to read than trying to read through a bunch of, wordy stuff, let's just say. So let's get back to these fundamentals of the framework. So what do you want in your framework? Well, you want intrinsic metrics, things that are going to look at those clinical facts, extract the actual facts. So fact checking is fundamentally what it's about. Now, what do we say? The subject matter experts, whoever's that clinician should be doing a lot of work to evaluate and make sure that the information going into the EMR is accurate. They should be that line of defense to make sure things are correct. Now, obviously, you're going to have to train your clinicians to understand the LLMs and the summarization technology is not perfect. Please review it carefully. Take it very seriously. Don't just assume that it's always correct because it's not going to be. Work on that with them and have that very well documented. And try to do things that help your clinician in terms of their review process. Have a little delay, make sure they can't just click on, oh, submit, like within a millisecond. That's just not going to help. So, structured extraction is certainly really useful. And compare, make sure your testing is comparing against a ground truth. Want to potentially use to expedite the process AI versus clinical reviews. Sometimes your test cases you can be extremely well known. You can have ground truth that may be extracted from your EMR already, or just test cases that you created, even synthetic ones for that matter. But have the AI review against a known output, right? So have a ground truth, excuse me, and have that be the test basis. That's a lot easier to automate than a completely unknown conversation. Fine tune your safety guardrails, right? But definitely have that working as a constant thing and continuous monitoring post deployment. Your LLM is going to drift. Your models just naturally do that over time. So be careful and watch how that works. Oops, a little too far. I want to bring up a couple of other points before I wrap things up. Regulatory and ethical considerations. Now, I'm sure everyone's familiar with GDPR and HIPAA compliance, right? So you need patient privacy guardrails. And you certainly need to think about software as a medical device. The NHS in England, in particular, has stated that all ambient scribes are software as a medical device. The question is, what class? They didn't say, at least not yet. Maybe that will change. But a lot of companies that are creating these tools are saying, yes, they are absolutely software as a medical device, and they're probably class 2. But we'll need to get there at some point. We need to bring them into the technology now, learn a lot from their implementation with a lot of guardrails and safety, and then we'll decide whether they're really class 2 devices or not, or in Europe, the class 2A. So it's certainly an ethical imperative to be safe and have transparency, right? And there are definitely EU AI acts, laws all across the United States, other issues that need to be addressed. And there can, in fact, with summarization in general, there could be marketing laws like Federal Trade Commission fair advertising laws and even human resources laws can come into effect. So please be aware of those. Let's just quickly go through a couple examples here. Conversation, patient says, oh, they don't have shortness of breath, but they report chest pain. The summary says that they have chest pain and shortness of breath. Well, that's a real problem. Now, long transcripts. Long transcripts, like I mentioned early on in this conversation, run into the common context-related challenges that I mentioned previously. Typically, a consultation is between 12 and 20 minutes. Some can run longer, especially with a specialist. So those are in particular challenge. They tend to run into these problems a lot more. So fundamentally, you're looking to create a great quality assurance system, and you want to learn from all the feedback that you can get from your clinicians, from your AI tools, everything that you can, from all the different kinds of testing you can do. And I'll also say, don't forget legal red teaming. Understand the laws, even if they're not AI laws. Like I mentioned, the HR laws, the marketing laws, those are all important. So let's conclude things here. Testing is technical and ethical responsibility. You must prioritize your patient safety. And fundamentally, I'd say, think of it like software. It is software. Software testing is coverage related. So my final message to you is LLM scribes reduce the burden only if they're safe and accurate. Please use them with care, but they're a really great technology when they work well for you and they are safe and accurate. So thank you very much. I appreciate your time, your attention, and always happy to answer any questions. Thank you.